My next guest name is Arthur Swerdloff, and we are going to be talking about special needs in Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, which I know many of us have lots of questions on and we're all a little bit confused on. So welcome, Arthur. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. It's good to be back with you again.
Absolutely. And I know last year we talked about, different trusts and things like that. And this year we're going to talk about Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. But before we do that, so people listening, if they didn't hear you last year, can you maybe give them a little bit of background about what you do and why you're so passionate?
Sure. My basic practice is as an estate planning attorney. We do regular trusts, wills, and base plans for families and individuals. In addition, we have been doing a great deal of special needs work over the last few years, building on some cases that we had done previously. I got into the special needs area in a more full way because of an experience I went through about 6 years ago. A dear friend was beginning to decline into a dementia that I didn't quite understand or know, in fact, what was happening. As I got drawn more and more into her situation, I realized I had to be very helpful. She had no one else at that point to take care of her. And so I was trying to figure out how to best help her, how to work with her doctors, how to work with other professionals. The literature was hard to get through. It was hard to get around the privacy rules to get information back and forth. So it was a very frustrating experience, let alone time that consumed what freedom I had. So as she progressed deeper into her what became the Alzheimer's, I had this feeling of being very much trapped, unable to go about my regular duties, take care of my law practice, see my children, visit with my brother who had recently retired, all that stuff. Until I finally got to the point where I said, okay, this isn't going to work anymore. I rallied what family she had, what professional help she had, got her taken care of, and had to say goodbye. And that was very difficult. As I got back to work in my office and put my life back together again, I made one commitment to myself that I would help families in a similar situation. I decided that I didn't want to do elder care per se in that respect. I thought I could be more of value with families with young children or teenagers becoming adults, as I felt that was an area that was underserved. So that's what I did. 2 years ago, I began to add the special needs emphasis to my practice, and that now brings us to the present day.
And so when we talk about special needs, what does that mean for those listening? And I mean, honestly, your story is just so, and it's so heart-wrenching, but I love that you were able to take something for that and make it good for the world, which sometimes people aren't able to do. And so because of that situation that happened to you, now you're able to help all these people, hopefully have an easier transition into whatever that looks like for them. But for those listening, special needs means different things to different people. What is special needs when you're talking about that?
In our part of the world, special needs really focuses in on a family or families where one of the members has a physical or mental disability or a combination of those that limits the ability to learn, limits the ability to care for themselves, puts a great deal of dependence on other members of the family to the extent that there are requirements for basic food and shelter, grooming, hygiene, medical care, educational requirements, so that the person can hopefully thrive with what capacity he or she has and can be helped over a longer period of time. So the special needs is basically a condition or conditions that limits the ability of the individual and, in fact, the family as caregivers to live a typical life, must be provided for in different ways. There are some definitions that are dependent on what type of assistance the family gets, but usually there has to be a psychological or medical diagnosis of the condition, whether it be a condition based on a change in learning ability or in development from an early age, or if it is something that occurs by an injury or accident later on. So all kinds of conditions fit the definition and present challenges to the family.
Now, when you talk about special needs met with governmental entitlements and benefits, how are those special needs? How do we know which ones those special needs are?
It sort of goes by the governmental agency that is involved. As you know, there are a number of ways that families can get help to cover their needs to support themselves or the individual, starting with the diagnosis of condition at school age or even preschool age, where intervention of one sort or another would be helpful. There may be programs through regional center, certainly in California. There can be some therapy assistance for intervention, helpful with speech, physical rehabilitation, that type of thing. It is really a function of how hard the family can fight to get what benefits are available. Once the condition is established and there is a beginning of help, usually there are a number of professionals, experts who can help along the way to assist the child and now even more so the family in coping with whatever's going on. And as I'm sure most of our listeners know, it's not a casual kind of situation. It's a 24-hour per day situation that just goes on and on. So whatever help can be fought for or provided is certainly vital. But the basic four things that are benefits that fall generally under the Social Security network are Social Security disability, the SSI, which is a funding, which then also brings with it Medicaid, which can be one of the most valuable benefits because it will cover a number of medical and therapeutic costs. It also can pick up prescriptions, long-term residential care, but it does not cover dental or eye care. And then there is Medicare itself for those who can show that they had some work experience and have reached an age level where it's clear that they're unable to provide for themselves or work to provide enough income to take care of their major medical needs. So The basic group of things, as you start getting out into the world of special needs, there are a number of agencies now that are trying to be of help, whether it is in terms of some kind of occupational assistance, trying to find vocations, support social interaction, and so on. So each period of growth of an individual kind of brings on different benefits, and the family just has to be alert to all that. In addition, of course, there are provisions for respite for caregivers to allow the family to have some free time, shadows in school, shadows or companions to take the child to different activities, or even if it's just a visit to the mall to walk around and enjoy some of the festivities that are out there.
Now, when you're talking about, just to make sure people understand, when you're talking about government, programs and government assistance, who's eligible for that? And is that when you were talking about, just depends on, I guess, state by state, what their guidelines are?
Yeah, it can certainly be a state-specific. Some states are much better at it. I recently set up a conservatorship for a child who grew up in another state. I won't identify it for privacy purposes, but in that state there was absolutely no regional center kind of program that had been established. There were no special provisions for education in the school system, and this child unfortunately grew up with extremely limited speech, practically just the ability to make sounds and grunts, and that was about it. He was diagnosed as a child with autism, but the parents were just sort of in a small town environment where they just didn't know to do anything better for this child. Finally, when he was 16, the parents came to the conclusion that the only thing that would help was if they moved and got to a state where there was assistance, and family friends it kind of pushed him in that direction. Fortunately, they had the means to pick up stakes and come to California, where the child was able to go to high school, get special needs provisions, therapeutic intervention, speech therapy, and started to socialize in a much better way. Still very limited speech, but able to understand the world around him much better. So it was a clear distinction between what happens in another state where there are minimum programs or none, and a place like California where there's a great deal of emphasis on helping the special needs child and the family.
And now when you talked about, I heard you said about a special needs trust, you were talking about the gentleman, you couldn't, obviously reveal his name. When do you need to do a special needs trust? And actually, what is a special needs trust for those that don't maybe know what that means?
Special needs trust is really something that was permitted starting in 1993 by federal statute to take into account the fact that if an individual, one way or another, has assets and has one of the conditions that we've described as being special needs, and wishes to receive or is receiving government benefits, there's usually a means test or an income test as to whether or not those benefits are available. So the legislation in 1993 made it possible to set up a trust, which was really what we call a supplemental trust, maybe even a support trust, but had restrictions as to what could be done with the assets that were put into it. And through careful planning and construction of that trust, the The trust sets up kind of a firewall between the assets in the trust and the benefits that are available from governmental entities, so that those benefits can be taken and remain in effect for the child or the now emerging adult or teenager. There are different types of special needs trusts.
That's what I was going to ask you. Are there different types?
The main one for our purposes typically is a third-party trust where the parents or other relatives, maybe an inheritance of some type, is directed towards the child. But one way or another, the parents are able to set up the trust. They become the trustees or designate close persons to become trustees, and that ultimately for the life of the individual shields the assets that are in that trust from making the person ineligible for benefits. The other main trust is the first-party trust, where a child or even adult individual receives an award for injury or tragic event. I have a couple of those going on now. And it becomes very important that those funds be directed into a trust at the beginning to preserve any eligibility that the beneficiary has for, at that point, what are typically very important medical benefits through Medicaid or even Medicare. There are other types of special needs trusts. There is one called the Pooled Trust, POOLED, which in effect allows assets to be contributed to a nonprofit organization that is set up for this purpose. And that fund, through its administration, takes care of the special needs of the individual for lifetime. At the end of that period, when the person dies, the funds, whatever are left, the share of income that was contributed or assets that were contributed would then remain with the pool and would be available to help other persons. It's just coming into vogue now. It depends, of course, on the age of the individual, how much dependence there will be on the funds, and how long actuarially these funds can last. So that's kind of your basic rundown. There are other trusts that are not quite full-blown special needs trusts, and they may or may not work to preserve the government entitlements. That you got to sit down and talk with your planner and figure out what the best approach is.
Now, we talked a little bit last time about guardianships and conservatorships. What are those, so people have a better understanding? And you mentioned a little bit as you were answering the other questions, but for those, I know for me, when you first have a baby, you're not thinking special needs, and then when you get a child with special needs, you're not thinking that you have to later on do anything regarding guardianship. So it feels for me that it doesn't really come in front of you until it's supposed to happen, which as they get older, but no one talks about it when they're 4 or 5, when they get diagnosed with autism, let's say. So for a lot of people out there, me being one until probably a couple of years ago, I didn't even know that we had to do this. So for those out there that are listening, I think there's probably a lot of people that will be kind of surprised, about this, but also it's good for them to have that information.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the basics then. In California, guardianship is a term used for a court-ordered person to take charge of a person under the age of 18. That would occur if something happened to the natural guardians, who are the parents. the court can then order, and it may have been nominated through the wills or other estate plan documents of the parents, a person or persons to become guardians of this now under 18 orphan, if you will. It's something we don't like to think about, but it does happen from time to time. Fortunately, not all that often, but still enough that you want to take that care off your mind. Once the child is turning 18, the child is, under the law, an adult. The child, without any other provision, would then be faced with having to make all of the decisions of life, including medical care, education, recreation, voting, social life, marriage, the list goes on and on. If the child, or now the adult, is high functioning, that may not be a major concern or a concern at all. But if the child has limitations and it's determined that, and this would be after, again, psychological evaluation, medical evaluation, if it's determined the child just would not be able to give informed consents, particularly in financial matters, if the child, or now the adult, just can't take care of the daily provisions of life, unable to live alone or independently, that type of thing, then the conservatorship, in many states it's still called guardianship, but in California it's called a conservatorship, again through the intervention and order of, in California, the probate court. An individual or individuals can be appointed to then make a number of decisions in certain areas that are ordered by the court. It's typically called the 5 of 7. The state statute lays out 7 different areas of living concerns, 5 of which usually can be granted to a conservatorship for control to the conservator, who then takes over these important decisions about health, education, daily living, giving consents for financial affairs, watching over the transportation and daily needs of the child. The 2 things that are usually left open by the court, and this is somewhat by statute, are the ability to vote, which the policy says is a very important right of every citizen. Number 2, in addition to being able to vote, there should be some leeway for social interaction with other people, which could lead towards marriage or close relationships. Parents, of course, are always concerned about that, but the courts feel that they don't want to have to interfere in those areas. So it's kind of, it's one of those gray areas where if the parents are the conservators or other close relatives or others who are appointed, they're generally going to watch over that anyway. But for purposes of the conservatorship order, it's usually the 5 areas that are granted in what's called a limited conservatorship. That would be versus what's called a general conservatorship, which is for individuals who really have no mental capacity or competency for any kind of activity, and that would take us, best example would be an area of extreme dementia or Alzheimer's. It's typically not something that we're all concerned with, but it does happen.
Now, let's jump into Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. public versus private insurance. Let's look at this. A lot of people get very confused regarding Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. And I know in California, correct me if I'm wrong, is Medicaid called Medi-Cal in California?
Yes.
Yes. So
is the joint partnership between the state of California and the federal government.
And so, a lot of people are very confused on getting Medicaid or Medi-Cal for their child with disabilities. I know I was, even for years, I thought that it had to mean that you had to be poverty stricken. It wasn't for my child. It would be if we had lost all of our jobs, kind of thing. And then I learned that there was a waiver, a medical waiver that we could get and we could apply. And we use it more for our secondary insurance because we do have a primary. But I still talk to parents who don't believe that they can get that. So I think even just going back to the basics of for those that maybe don't understand that they are eligible. I don't know about every state. Obviously you would. But I know in California, am I right that they're eligible to at least apply if they have a child or an individual with disabilities?
Yes. Again, it's a function of getting a proper psychological evaluation or medical evaluation that points out the needs of the child. The most common way to be able to receive Medicaid benefits is through SSI. If the application is approved for SSI benefits, along with that comes Medicaid, and that is where its great value can be. What we're advocating today is, and especially now with hopefully the continuation of the Affordable Care Act, is the expansion of Medicaid. It's mandated for persons with disability and mental health problems. That was something that was also in the 90s put into effect as mandatory. So through the combination of applying for SSI and proving the limitations of the individual, that medical care can be gotten. Why we are happier when there is also private insurance is so that care will not be limited within whatever guidelines the Medi-Cal program may have. There are not supposed to be caps to the limits of care, but you're now in effect pleading with the government to make sure certain things are done. If you have private insurance along with it, especially if it incorporates dental and vision care, then you've covered the field pretty well. Also, it may help you with certain prescriptions that may not be covered on the schedule of Medicaid. That can be gotten with private insurance. It also can take some financial strain off the family where they don't have to dip into savings and resources to cover medical needs that may not be available through the Medicaid programs. So by having the combination, now the children up to age 26 can be covered by their parents' insurance. There is really all reason in the world to make sure that the private insurance can be attained to also cover the child.
And so it's at 26 years of age that if you have insurance, a primary insurance, is that all primary insurances that at 26, or is that just some?
I'm not absolutely sure on that. I'd have to do some research on my own, but my understanding is under the Affordable Care Act, as long as the parent has medical insurance, the child must be covered by it, if so elected, up to age 26. I'm not aware of limitations on that, but wiser heads than I may probably know the answer to that question right now.
Okay, and then when you're talking SSI, is that something is that different from IHSS, or is that SSI? Is that part of IHSS, the in-home service support?
That's not an area that I've dealt with, so I'm afraid I can't really answer that question right now, but it's something I would be glad to check out. And I can send you some.
Is there a certain age that SSI happens, or is that doesn't matter the age of that child?
I think it's really whether you can qualify under the regulations of the governmental entity in charge. Likely you have to go through the county coordinator on that. But I don't think there is an age restriction. You just have to show the need to begin to qualify for SSI. Typically, however, if the family situation is somewhat normal, there is the obligation of the family to take care of the basic support of the child. So, I think there are all kinds of limitations that may restrict the ability to get the coverage until the child is older. But once the need is demonstrated and the family can't meet it, SSI can come into it.
Gotcha. And then when we're talking about going back to public versus private insurance, is there essential benefit packages, for mental health?
Yes. Mental health has now been added to Medicaid as a required type of care. That was one of the major things that was made clear in the Affordable Care Act. So mental health and other disabilities related to neurological conditions can be covered by Medicaid.
And then what about pre-existing conditions?
That was certainly one of the great benefits of the Affordable Care Act in that they're no longer, insurance companies are no longer permitted under private insurance to limit coverage because of a pre-existing condition. Certainly for children who have early onset of these things, there would be a pre-existing condition. So it would be impossible for them to qualify for any kind of coverage under a standard insurance policy. So that is an essential element of the Affordable Care Act. And it, I think, frankly, is one of the big reasons why there has been such a pushback on the attempts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. I'm avoiding calling it Obamacare, but that's how it's commonly known. And I think ultimately President Obama will go down as very highly praised for the fact that he was able to get this accomplished. We'll see what happens in the future. I would think the special needs community is very much behind retaining all of the major provisions of the Affordable Care Act and is probably quite active in the pushback against the repeal and replace.
Now, is Medicaid, do you think this is a new era beginning? Do you think this is, when we're looking at the different states and the expansion of Medicaid, is this kind of like where we're heading to, you think?
It seems to be. Certainly that was what was happening until the new administration came in this January. There was great favorability to expanding Medicaid within the states. That seems to be continuing on in states even like Arkansas, even in Indiana, certainly in California and New York, most Northeast states. They all have signed on to the expansion of Medicaid. To a degree now, that is causing governors of states to speak out, causing a great deal more interchange of ideas about what is appropriate for medical care. So I think on balance, at least for now, we're going to see a good number of states expanding their Medicaid programs. It is a way for the states to cope with typically the burdens that they carry anyway for the welfare of their citizens to take care of medical needs. And so if the federal government can be a participant in helping that effort, the governors of states and the legislatures of states are all for it. Some exceptions, but those exceptions seem to be listening to their constituents and loosening up their attitude.
And what about the home waiver plan? What exactly does that mean for those that might not understand that?
Home waiver plan is an attempt now to get more and more care within the home, particularly for caregivers, for respite programs, to eliminate the need for people to have to go to acute care or rest home type care. It's more something applying to adults and the elderly, but certainly it's very helpful in the situation where a caregiver is giving almost full-time or is giving full-time to the care of the special needs person in their family. So if there are ways that home care provisions can be made, that is now beginning to become possible through Medicaid.
And that's what I was talking about earlier with I can only speak in California, but in California, if they go to their regional center and then basically apply for a Medi-Cal waiver, because you have to have Medi-Cal in order to apply for what you're calling home waiver plan. Those are the IHSS services. And what will happen then is either depending on the needs that they determine that the child needs, they will pay either a parent to keep the child at home, in a sense as the parent is the provider, or they can choose a different provider and doesn't have to be the parent. But again, it all starts with that Medi-Cal first. Like you can't even get it without the Medi-Cal, waiver and applying for that. That was something that we learned about years later. We didn't understand any of that, but I know there's a lot of support groups out there too. Like if somebody goes on Facebook, for example, they can type that in. Now I don't know what it's called in other states, but I can just tell you what it's called in California. What is what's really the patient's right? I guess when they're a child, their rights are, really based on children law and what the parents need to do as a parent. Did the rights change as they become older, or are they about the same? If it doesn't matter the age due to the fact that they have a disability.
No, I don't think it really matters as to age. What is emerging is the philosophy that every person has the right to decent medical care, and therefore patients have rights to decent medical care. So the states are taking note of that. I believe it's being embedded in legislation, although I'm not as clear on that as I should be. But rather than good medical care being a privilege, it is now looked at as being an absolute right. Although obviously there's political difference as to just how true that is. But that seems to be the trend.
And then payback, is there any payback required for, obtaining Medi-Cal or Medicaid?
For younger individuals, the answer is no. Except in certain cases. We have to separate out the personal injury kind of thing where there may have been Medi-Cal or Medicaid benefits paid because of a severe injury or incident or trauma, whether it was criminal or accidental, where the individual will need an intense amount of care, at least for a period of time, if not for a lifetime. The Medicare, Medi-Cal, or Medicaid statutes did provide for the payback of those benefits, but there were some limits. The individual had to be over age 65. There was some question as to whether or not the payback went to things that occurred prior to the accident. But one of the provisions of the Special Needs Care Act is that if the funds that the individual received because of the accident or victimization, if those funds came from a settlement or a court order, that the funds are considered to be those of the individual, usually put into a special needs trust by order of court, and there is a provision for payback. So if Medicare or Medicaid has paid for a number of those benefits, assume somebody who's been in an acute care condition for a long time, may have even been comatose for a period of time, a good share of that will be paid back once there is a cessation of the condition and the individual returns to normalcy. But typically now that's loosened up to mean really there is a lifetime lien by Medi-Cal, Medicare, Medicaid, and when the individual dies, then there will be an attempt to take back what had been paid out by those entities at the person's death, if there is in fact any kind of remaining estate, and particularly in the special needs trust. That is loosening up somewhat. California just passed at the beginning of this year a statute that limits the ability of Medi-Cal to reach back for benefits. In the case of married persons, the estate of the individual who then dies can pass on to the spouse and not be touched until after that spouse is gone. And now typically only the probate estate of the persons, or if the persons were in nursing homes and this happened after age 65, those persons would be subject to the payback, but individuals up to that point are not. So typically trusts would not be touched, and the individual in effect would have had to be in a nursing home, which started after age 65. So I'm hopeful that the rules and regulations are still being worked out on this. I'm hopeful that will also apply to the aid that special needs families receive. But that remains to be seen. We'll watch that very closely.
Now, what about, let's talk about prescription cost. Is that covered also by Medicaid or Medi-Cal? And can you combine that with your private and your public, meaning your Medi-Cal or Medicaid insurance?
The answer to that is yes, I think, to each of your points. There are some restrictions that Medicaid will impose in terms of the types of drugs that are permitted. If there is private insurance that will pick up the differential, and sometimes, of course, you have to prove to the private insurer that the drug is absolutely necessary, particularly if it's more experimental or a newer drug. But by having the combination, you've got a pretty good shot at having everything covered. The so-called donut hole for seniors is now gone, again, through the Affordable Care Act and action of the Congress. So prescriptions are easier, but you still have to watch the deductibles and the limitations of types that may be imposed. So you almost have to have a person who is an expert in these areas to advise a family as to what is good or not.
Absolutely. And, what about, some people might have heard, what's the essential coverage mandate? What does that mean?
Under the Affordable Care Act, there were set out a number of areas that were deemed to be essential for the medical care of individuals. I'm just going through my notes to find the kind of a rundown of what those things could be. So forgive me for reading this, but it's a pretty extensive list, starting with ambulatory patient services, emergency services, hospitalization, maternity and newborn care, mental health and substance use disorder services, prescription drugs, rehabilitative and habilitative services and devices, laboratory services, preventive and wellness services. I think that's become a very popular element of the ACA, Affordable Care Act, in that you can go for your annual physical without it not being covered by insurance, in an effort to preserve health before it becomes critical and catch it early, or get the individual to utilize better health practices, diet, exercise, etc. Chronic disease management is considered an essential benefit covered under the mandate of ACA, and pediatric services, including oral and vision care. So I think there is now allowability for children in their pediatric services to get dental and vision care covered.
That's wonderful.
So that's list.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Now, so it seems like if we're getting better health versus less expense, would I be right in that?
Yes.
And
there are still rules on deduction, on annual deduction. So you have to watch out in the insurance plans what the deductibles are. But I think there are limits as to how much the deductible can reach. Currently, those limits are about $6,000 per year for individuals and close to $12,000 per year for families. So you've got to watch the deductibles with the particular type of insurance that you're buying under the Affordable Care Act. And that, again, is one of the major issues raised by the repair and replace, where there was an attempt to increase, especially for seniors, the amount of deductible that had to be met before benefits were available. So it's still complicated, and part of the workout that has to happen over the next several years to get medical care under control. but nonetheless, at least there is a structure to it, and people have to plan accordingly.
Now, you talked a little bit about the payment depending on alternatives. You talked about potentially if someone were to die and things like that, what would be happening to perhaps the ones left behind, what would be owed. Let's talk a little bit about the alternatives when you're looking at special needs trusts, like who pays on the death, who takes care of all that. Let's say, they don't have a lot of family, left over, or maybe they have a little bit of family left over. What happens to that individual, debt when they pass?
Are you talking in terms of medical benefits or just in general?
In general, when you're looking at a special needs trust.
There are a couple ways that, as practitioners, we deal with it. One is that we usually put a provision in a special needs trust that says that the covered individual, and it has nothing to do with competency or mental capacity, has the ability to designate individuals who would receive remaining assets of the trust upon the death of that individual. Now, in many instances, that person is not going to have capacity to do it. But it now means that the trust has kind of an open end as to who can participate later on when the individual dies. If there are remaining siblings or parents, potentially even grandparents, they are all in the line of succession, and they could conceivably then share in the assets that are left if the individual dies prematurely or predeceases them. So it's something that has to be carefully thought out. It is possible to name specific beneficiaries, but you have to be careful because you don't want to have the risk that the trust would be considered a sham of some kind and just a device to get money back to the family. So in essence is illustrating that there is, quote, some control by the beneficiary as to where the assets will go, but in essence it goes by default under the state statute to the persons who would inherit if there were no will, that type of thing.
Now, what about for gifting away their assets? Are they able, in a special needs trust, alternatives to special needs trust, are you able to gift away assets?
There's some question about that. It depends the source of the assets. And if you are, if you're receiving government benefits, you have to be very careful about gifting. The gifting could be done by the trustee on the basis that it's something that, and probably in amounts that are relatively modest, something that would be consistent with the membership in the family of the patient, the beneficiary. So gifting is kind of a murky area. I wouldn't advise doing it without counseling from an attorney or person well-versed in special needs law. And it's sort of the same thing in terms of how a trust addresses what would happen to the assets upon the death of the beneficiaries. So all this has to be carefully thought out. You may be talking or having in mind a little bit the ability to spend down money. That is an alternative to setting up a special needs trust, in that if there are assets on hand that the individual has that are interfering with receiving benefits, the person may want to spend down his or her money on those things that are important to their well-being. to then allow the government benefits to kick in. That again is an area that has to be carefully thought out. The gifting away of assets is often done by senior persons in an effort to make themselves eligible for Medicaid. And again, that's a very tricky area that has to be worked out, should be worked out with an advisor who understands all the ins and outs of it.
And so what about a pooled trust?
At the beginning, we talked a little bit about the types of special needs trusts. The third one that I mentioned is called the pooled trust, something relatively new, although it's been available for quite a while, that allows, particularly where there's been, quote, kind of a windfall. The individual certainly wouldn't think of it as a windfall if it came from a serious accident or injury or some unfortunate incident. But the funds that are received, typically through a court intervention or court action, would be available then to go into what is a charitable organization set up for the purpose of taking care of special needs persons. And that would be a lifetime care, so that the funds that are contributed come out of the hands of the individual and the family, are administered by a professional trustee employed by the charitable organization. At the person's death, his or her share then left to the organization and is used to support other individuals.
Gotcha.
Certainly, if an individual appears to be destined to a life of medical care or acute care, that would be a good alternative. But some families where perhaps there are other assets and they're certainly not interested in the funds themselves, may decide that that's a good way to help similarly situated people and allow the funds to eventually stay with the nonprofit. So more people are beginning to look at these, but they're certainly not to a state of popularity yet.
Well, it seems at least we have some options out there that maybe we didn't used to have before, and it seems as though the laws are hopefully going more in the favor of the person with the disability and making more sense. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
I cannot believe our hour is almost up. I feel like I've learned so much, and it went by so fast. Where do people learn more about you, to get professional advice, and where can they go if they want to get in touch with you?
We have our own website. We're beginning to put more information on it. Besides our general trust information, we have some blogging we're doing about special needs. Our website is called lawwithasmile.com, so it can be accessed on the web. We have also a resource guide that was in preparation last year when we talked, which I'm kind of proud of. It's about a 40-page treatise on what to do when your child is turning 18. So it talks a great deal about conservatorship, but it also, at our insistence, starts at the early age. It starts at diagnosis of condition and gives a lot of help in terms of what to do when you first get the diagnosis, how to access the regional centers, how to access professionals who can be of great help for medical and therapeutic interventions. Begins to talk a bit about the medical resources that are available. And then an area I'm very happy about, and I certainly want to see emphasized as we go on, is the area of vocational guidance for special needs persons. It is essential in my mind that they, as much as possible, be pulled into mainstream life in an atmosphere that is still conducive to them and not overwhelming, but that they get training not only in socialization but in occupations so that they can become very productive in their own way. And that seems to be catching on. Parents are forming their own businesses or employing their children in these businesses to give them that opportunity. There are also nonprofits that are creating jobs for kids with special needs and adults. And there are organizations now that actually will place children in training and then into jobs.
It just seems like the world is basically opening their arms a lot more for our kiddos of any age than they used to ever before. I think that's something as a parent, it's so wonderful to know about. So your two websites were lawwithasmile.com. The other one for the resource guide is familieswithspecialneeds.com, correct?
Yes. Familieswithspecialneeds.com. You can download our resource guide. That's available in PDF. In addition, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
In addition, we are now sponsoring an app that is accessible on mobile devices that gives some of the same information that is in our resource guide with the addition of a community board.
Wonderful.
And present some questions to their peers and other families that are faced with the same questions. We're trying to stimulate some interest in that now so that we can get a good flow of answers and questions.
And that app, would that be on lawwithasmile.com?
Yeah, that's also, no, not.
Where would they find that app? Would they can't go to the website and find it, or does they have to, how do they find the app?
They have it on the website and would give you information to get there.
Perfect.
The best way to do it is to go to the App Store, depending on the type of device you have, whether it's Apple or Android, and download the app through Families with Special Needs.
Oh, okay.
You can go familieswithspecialneeds.com on your app device.
And get it that way.
Get the app downloaded, and then that'll take you right to it.
Wonderful. Well, I know how busy you are. I know what you are doing for so many families out there. And just thank you for taking this time and talking to so many of us today to really make a difference. Do you have any last words that you want to give them and leave them with a message? I know some people right now might be scared. They might feel overwhelmed. What's your last message that you want to kind of leave them with?
I think the thing that is most important for our families who are facing these needs is knowledge. The more knowledge you have, the more you can act on behalf of your kids, the more they will benefit from intervention and help. It's just essential that you educate yourself as much as possible. We, over the last several months, created a list of organizations, including Autism Hope Alliance, that are now fully engaged in helping other families. So there's a ton of help out there. So for those families who are kind of unsure what to do, get in touch with a local organization around you, certainly the regional center. and take advantage of all of the help that is available.
Absolutely.
There's a broad community of support, and our families have got to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so very much, and thank you for all that are listening.